Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
You have to admit the reality that there's certain behavior that people are saying you have to engage in to deal with climate change. And I think one of the great mistakes of the climate movement, the environment movement, is that it has allowed this to be too much of a behavioral debate and not a sufficiently scientific debate. So there are things we know about coronavirus, but there's a lot we don't know about it. And yet we're doing things. We tell people to change, wash their hands, to wear a mask, to shelter at home, there are a whole series of social distancing and so forth. But we haven't turned it into a behavioral debate. Why? Because it is so visibly dangerous. It's killing people now. And climate change is sort of still out there for people, so that the debate is centered more on the behavior. Oh, you can't eat meat, or you can't, you got to close your window. You got to change your heat. You can't do this or that, rather than focusing on the scientific choices and the expertise that is staring us in the face that says this is even more dangerous than coronavirus. Climate crisis is more dangerous than coronavirus because it will create more pandemics.
Well, that was John Kerry, the failed presidential candidate and the disastrous Secretary of State for Obama, the unaccomplished senator who was speaking at an MIT video call earlier this fall. Well, back then he was just a harmless academic, but now he's being tipped as the climate czar by Joe Biden if, as increasingly looks likely, Biden does become the next president of the United States. What does it mean to have such an ideologue as climate czar, especially after 4 years of pro-energy administration under Donald Trump? Joining us now is the man who would know, our friend Marc Morano, the boss of ClimateDepot.com. Marc, great to see you again.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Ezra.
You know what? We're both rooting for Donald Trump. You're an American. I'm a friend of America from up north here. We both, amongst other things, admire his approach to the global warming scheme. You know, I'll never forget, he said, I represent Pittsburgh, not Paris. Well, John Kerry was the U.S. negotiator who went to Paris to sell out American industry to China. Looks like he's going to be back in charge of that file.
Yes, it does. One of Biden's first acts is to announce this. John Kerry is going to be as the presidential climate envoy. And what's interesting is Kerry, as Secretary of State, of course, was heavily involved in climate during the Obama administration. In fact, he went so far as to bring his granddaughter out when they signed the UN Paris Agreement. And they agreed to it in 2015, December. But a couple months later, in 2016, Kerry brought out his granddaughter to sign the historic agreement to show how important it was. And then, of course, a few years later, they declared the UN Paris Agreement would not save the planet after all. All of these leaders, including top UN officials, all admitted it wasn't enough, it was inadequate, and we need a lot more. But John Kerry has been at this climate hustle, if you will, for decades, and now he's going to have his highest profile role yet in the upcoming Biden administration, assuming the election fraud doesn't pan out. And by the way, I think election fraud is going to be very difficult to prove. I don't expect President Trump to be successful. Sorry if I disappointed some of your listeners there.
No, you know what? I'm of the same view. I believe in my bones that the Tammany Hall Democratic Party machine in the big cities stole the vote, as they often do. I think, as Joel Pollak says, most of the stealing was approved in advance by the courts when they changed the voting rules just a few months before Election Day in the name of the pandemic. So the pandemic allowed the Democrats to harvest votes and mail-in votes. I think that's what stole the election, not so much shenanigans on the day of. But you know what? There's a flicker of hope left, but I think we have to be rational and assume that Biden will be the next president. I think he'll be president largely in name only. He is the least vigorous president to be elected, at least in the television age. He's distracted. He mumbles. I think he's losing his cognitive sharpness. So who he appoints is doubly important. With Trump, there was all his cabinet was constantly on edge. He would sack someone like he did on The Apprentice. With Biden, I don't know who the real power will be, but if John Kerry is given this position, I think he might have some power.
He will. In fact, this is in many ways the progressive left's ideal president, Joe Biden, because he's a guy, he's puts up a gentle, unthreatening, grandfatherly old man image. At the same time, he's not vigorous, he's not engaged, he's not strong leader at all in any shape or form, but they get to run the show behind the scenes. And if you look back at his climate, particularly on climate, we had AOC, the Sunrise Movement, Bernie Sanders, John Kerry, all of them heavily involved in writing Biden's proposals, for as candidate Biden. So it makes perfect sense that they're going to be now in charge as he's president. And don't be fooled. Don't think, oh, well, Biden is not that radical. Biden's not going to be one calling the shots here. He might be able to stop one or two extreme things if it catches his attention, or if some interest group, particularly labor unions when it comes to energy policy, scream loud enough. But in general, they're going to run roughshod. And the fact that John Kerry is in here is a good indication of that. And the big thing here is, of course, the COVID climate connection of John Kerry.
Well, yeah, I'm just reading an essay in Market Watch that is on your website, Climate Depot. Here's John Kerry. He said, you could just as easily replace the words climate change with COVID-19. It is truly the tale of two pandemics, deferred, denied, and distorted, one with catastrophic consequences, the other with even greater risk if we don't reverse course. The long-term parallels between this pandemic and tomorrow's gathering storm of climate crisis are more clear. I think that this pandemic is exactly that. They were never really able to scare people about climate. Sure, they scared kids and they scared Greta into depression over it, but grown-ups weren't scared enough to change their lives and how they lived. But this pandemic has absolutely scared, I don't know, half the people into wearing masks and staying home and lockdowns. And it's the same junk science, junk economics, but it seems to work. So Kerry's no dummy. He's going to use the pandemic argument to get all his other errands done.
Yeah, in fact, he goes even beyond just the solutions. He is talking about these I don't want to butcher the word, but zoonogical affections, the idea that animals, the animal world, by humans encroaching on the animal world, we are allowing these virus mutations to happen. And that's how we end up with zoonogical. That's how we end up with COVID breakdown. So he's basically going to turn climate policy into a subset of COVID policy. In other words, if we tackle climate change, we'll have less viruses, less fear. And what's interesting about this is I'm writing a book, Ezra, on the Green New Deal. I'm just finishing it up. It'll be out next year. But the book is being rewritten as I'm writing it. Because if you look back a year ago, the Green New Deal could cost $93 trillion. It's going to essentially plan our lives. It's going to affect it. All of that is now out the window. We have COVID lockdowns, which have done more destruction to our society. One estimate in South Africa, I think, was 29 people died for every life allegedly saved during a lockdown. And the economic, it's like bombing one's own economy, was in the report that I wrote, quoting experts on this. So the idea that climate change is the number one issue is gone out the window. They are going to now have climate as a subservient to their master of COVID. And it's for the exact reason you said. You can't scare people about hurricanes or floods or future sea level rise when you can tell them that their grandmother or their parent or they're going to end up on a ventilator or die unless you wear a mask. We're talking about immunity passports, mandatory vaccines. Now, Qantas Airline announced today you can't fly without a COVID passport. This is the dream of the regulatory state. COVID is. In fact, the quote, Jane Fonda, COVID is God's gift to the left. That's what you need to know about this. And that's a direct, exact quote from actress Jane Fonda speaking about the COVID restrictions and how much she loves it.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.